Some Hollywood stories wither away over time. This one simply won't die. The darkest part is the nightmarish Thanksgiving weekend in 1981 when 3 stars headed out on a yacht near Catalina Island amid fog. By sunrise, only 2 returned. Natalie Wood, cherished, brilliant, at the time of her greatest stardom, was discovered in the icy water with unexplained bruises, below a life jacket she wasn't wearing properly, and a timeline that never added up with the story we were told. Witness statements changed, crucial files disappeared, and the people closest to her kept secrets that only darkened the shadows over that night. Decades later, the mystery endures, untouched by time and impossible to forget. A quiet dinner hiding sharp tension. It was Thanksgiving night, 1981, and a dense, cold fog was shrouding the dark waters of Catalina Island. The yacht, Splendor, painted in polished wood and bronze, was lying quiet as a personal island of light and shadow. Robert Wagner, a polished movie star, had often hosted friends aboard that vessel, making it a familiar escape. The same evening, he had dinner and offered drinks to Natalie Wood, his wife, and an actress adored since youth, and Christopher Walken. The 3 of them were dining at Doug's Harbor Reef, where their features were delineated by lamps whose light made them have a frail and golden glow. Waitstaff later remembered tension at the table, a brittle edge in the voices that ruffled the restaurant's usual calm. A diner overhears a conversation as Walken compliments Natalie over her talent, and Wagner responds with a clipped and covetous reply. That little conflict, noted by eyewitnesses, would become a splinter that later opened into a larger, painful wound. At 10, the 3 were back at the Splendor, falling into the mist like characters returning to a stage. Voices in the fog that don't align. Captain Dennis Davern, steady and careful, was responsible for the yacht that night and watched the mood change. Later, he told evaluators that he heard shouting and the breaking glass hitting the deck. The noise pierced the fog, creating an echoing silence that was heavier than the fog itself. When Wagner was questioned about the evening in his later years publicly, he gave a calm, simple version, saying that it was pleasant and ordinary. However, several crew members and observers depicted the night in a different way. Harsh words, slammed glass, and a silent woman. Around 1:30 in the morning, Wagner reported Natalie missing, though other dockside witnesses said screams were heard much earlier. That timeline mismatch would later raise questions about delay, about who called for help, and when light was allowed to search. When search crews discovered Natalie's body before dawn, they found her less than a kilometer away from Avalon Harbor. She wore a red nightgown and a life jacket fastened in a strange manner and improperly, minute details that would not easily be explained. Bruises that rewrite an old story. An autopsy returned findings that many found puzzling, and many would later dispute with stubborn insistence. Medical notes recorded bruising on Natalie's wrists, knees, and arms, injuries that at least one coroner privately described as suspicious. Coroner Thomas Noguchi wrote in his private notes a terse, controversial line suggesting those injuries weren't consistent with a simple fall. Yet the observation did not appear in the official public autopsy report, leaving a gap between private concern and public record. Some of the photographed evidence from the night would later go missing and then reappear 3 decades after the event. In 1981, investigators concluded it was an accidental drowning, but pinpointed alcohol, darkness, and cold water as contributing factors. But family and friends, along with a number of journalists, believed that this official story left too many loose ends and unanswered questions. Small facts accumulated into a larger discomfort. A backward life jacket, missing scene photos, and untested fingernail scrapings. Those anomalies started to sound like fragments of a different story, one far more naughty than the tidy official verdict. Grief wrapped in questions of motive. During the months after Natalie's death, the public watched image and grief collide on a relentless stage of headlines and flowers. Her funeral, held at Westwood Memorial Park, drew Hollywood out in a hush, faces lined with grief, and camera flashes frozen like rain. Robert Wagner was at the center of that public grief, named guardian of their 2 young daughters in Natalie's will. The will, in a few lines of legal language, stated that the estate would go to the children, with Wagner as their guardian. Yet within months, Wagner started to sell properties that had been Natalie's retreats and personal possessions, once hers alone. The family members and close friends bristled at these moves, sensing haste where mourning should have been slow and private. Press coverage sharpened into suspicion, and the glossy pages that once celebrated celebrity started asking questions of motives and timing. The first public fights over memory and money quietly set a new stage where legal documents would fight with family memory. What was left of Natalie's legacy would not just be divided by estate law, but by the stories that each side told. A past that won't stay silent. Wagner's past romances and scandals formed a backdrop that seemed to make the tragedy of Catalina both strangely public and intimate at once. In the 1950s, studios shaped him into a polished leading man, figure the press loved to match with famous women. The affairs with icons like Barbara Stanwyck lit the gossip columns, especially since she was decades older, and the match seemed so scandalous. Those early headlines carved a reputation for Wagner that mixed charm with a pattern of passionate but sometimes stormy affairs. When he first married Natalie, the marriage became a media event, a fairy tale image pressed onto glossy covers. The marriage later strained under pressures such as unequal careers and jealousies, both public and private. They briefly separated, and Wagner remarried, but the gravitational pull of Natalie and a later reconciliation would define much of his life. It was as if their return to each other in the 1970s redeemed them, but old patterns and rivalries had quietly lingered beneath the surface. That history meant that when misfortune arrived, suspicion could find purchase in a soil already tilled by rumor and resentment. Lana's relentless search stirs old shadows. For Natalie's family, the years after her death hardened into a steady searching campaign for answers that would not arrive easily. Her sister Lana refused to accept the simple explanation that the world was offering and made her doubt a public cause. Lana's persistence fanned a small fire of investigation that, from time to time, drove the case again into public view. She filed legal actions, spoke to reporters, and demanded re-examination of evidence that earlier investigators had dismissed. Captain Davern's later change in testimony became a crucial pivot that gave new momentum to Lana's efforts for truth. Davern would say years later that Wagner had been enraged that night, that he had prevented immediate searching by blocking lights. That admission reopened the case to fresh scrutiny and made timelines and actions on that night feel newly suspect. If one had impeded the first frantic search, information lost in those early hours might have forever altered what was found. The family's quest to find answers had turned into a long, stubborn ache, the refusal to let sleep smooth over jagged uncertainties. A reopened case unsettles Hollywood again. In 2011, the Los Angeles County Sheriff announced a formal reopening of the investigation, a decision that sent ripples through Hollywood. The new attention uncovered photographs and reports that had been hidden from public view for decades. With more up-to-date forensic knowledge, investigators re-evaluated bruises and abrasions, details that had either been overlooked or downplayed. The press coverage resurfaced the debate over whether these injuries could have come from a struggle before Natalie went into the water. Some forensic voices suggested that the circular bruises around her wrists looked consistent with being grabbed or held by another person. Other findings underlined the backward life jacket as a detail difficult to reconcile with a lucid person trying to save herself. The reopening didn't yield immediate arrests, but it changed the death from a closed case to an active question. The revised files in the investigation eventually named Robert Wagner a person of interest, that most pretentious of legal phrases. That designation did not equal guilt, but it altered public perception and hardened an ongoing cultural curiosity about that night. Media turns the mystery into memory. Press, hungry for narrative and scandal, pushed the story into countless columns and TV specials that shaped public memory. Documentaries and investigative pieces that aired carried images and testimony that would be replayed in living rooms and argued over. Shows like CBS's 48 Hours used forensic images and interviews with witnesses that seemingly brought the audience closer to the truth. Journalists at Vanity Fair and elsewhere began digging through old files, interviewing witnesses, and publishing meticulous reconstructions. Those long features often focused on unanswered questions and the contrast between Wagner's public grieving and private contradictions. Critics noted that there were inconsistencies in Wagner's later memoirs with recollections by crew and friends who had known detailed specifics. Memories and documents collided in print to create a public dossier that read less like the telling of a single story than a slow-burning trial. For many readers, the fragments collected by journalists became as persuasive as official reports once were. A story stitched from interviews and old statements, it forced the public to relive the mystery. Memoirs that complicate the public story. Robert Wagner's own voice entered the public record through memoirs and interviews that shaped how many would remember the tragedy. His memoir, released in 2008, Pieces of My Heart, presented his memories of decades of living in Hollywood and the private grief he carried. He devoted many pages to Natalie, reflecting on their love in a tone that mixed nostalgia with denial of darker moments. Readers and critics felt that the memoir rewrote certain episodes, smoothing edges and downplaying details uncomfortable to Wagner's image. Family members, especially Lana, were outraged by the book, feeling it allowed Wagner to frame a narrative that others could not contend with. The pattern of partial revelation and careful omissions was continued in another memoir years later, and in further interviews. Those books entered a public debate about who owns memory and which versions of events should stand as truth. And when, months later, a close friend or colleague spoke differently of Wagner's behavior, readers began to weigh memoir against witness testimony. The tension between personal narrative and investigative findings created a tight space in which sympathy and suspicion could sit uneasily. A narrative challenged by fresh voices. Robert Wagner's own voice entered the public record through memoirs and interviews that shaped how many would remember the tragedy. His memoir, Pieces of My Heart, published in 2008, showed his recollection of decades of living in Hollywood and the private grief he carried. He wrote many pages about Natalie, his love for her conveyed in a tone both nostalgic and in denial of darker moments. Readers and critics alike felt that the memoir rewrote certain episodes, rounding off rough edges and downplaying details uncomfortable to Wagner's image. The family members, and Lana in particular, were very angry because the book allowed Wagner to frame a narrative before others could refute it. Years later, another memoir and further interviews continued that pattern of partial revelation and careful omissions. Those books entered a public debate about who owns memory and which versions of events should stand as truth. When a close friend or colleague later spoke differently of Wagner's behavior, readers began to weigh memoir against witness testimony. Contradictions between personal narrative and investigative findings created a tight space in which sympathy and suspicion coexist in discomfort. Old testimonies stir a new reckoning. The reopened investigation in the 2010s depended heavily upon witness recollections that had aged but not quieted. Captain Davern's revised testimony proved pivotal in that he described Wagner's anger and an order preventing immediate searching. If true, that act transformed the critical first minutes following Natalie's disappearance into a disputed scene of decisions and delay. Investigators compared the voice of Davern with dockside timelines and a new forensic review to attempt to pin down what happened in those fogged hours. The 2012 Sheriff's Report and subsequent updates listed injuries that were not recognized in the initial findings. detailing them with new specificity. Those details drew forensic experts into careful debate about whether bruising patterns could stem from post-mortem contact or from pre-fall struggle. Forensics are rarely definitive in isolation, but the pile of anomalies created a portrait less consistent with a simple accidental drowning. The law moved cautiously, constrained by evidence standards, witness reliability, and a statute of limitations that shaped possible outcomes. But the legal files reopened the societal wound and forced Hollywood and the public to reframe old assumptions. A friend's words break old silence. Stefanie Powers, Wagner's colleague and friend for many years, later provided testimony that disturbed old loyalties. She'd been close to Wagner throughout the long run of their show and remembered him as charming but sometimes frighteningly withdrawn. In late interviews, she described moments when Wagner would appear haunted, silent between takes, as if listening to some distant sounds of water. Her recollections of reading a redacted autopsy file and noticing missing pages added dramatic weight to public suspicions. When a trusted friend speaks of missing pages and altered files, the public often hears not an accusation but a worrying confirmation. Stefanie never publicly accused Wagner of murder. Instead, she suggested that the documents had been sanitized of crucial details for reasons unknown. Those words, from a person who had defended and understood him, broke the neat circle of celebrity protection. Her comments pushed new audiences to think again about how relationships with industry can conceal, filter, or rebrand traumatic facts. Wagner's supporters countered that memory can fade, and sometimes friends, when placed under decades of pressure, misremember specifics. Motive lost in shadows and speculation. To many observers, the question of motive presented murky shadows rather than clear light where answers should be found. Some said jealousy and a volatile temper might have started an argument that could have risen to tragedy on the yacht's deck. Others pointed out other explanations: an accidental fall on a dark deck, intoxication, or a tragic attempt to leave unnoticed. Rumors of financial motives were whispered in tabloids, and thin investigatory pieces, especially after the rapid sales of Natalie's properties. Yet direct evidence linking money with a violent act never emerged clearly enough to obtain charges or condemnation. Legal standards require proof beyond a reasonable doubt, a high bar that the 1981 case, reopened, struggled to meet. That lack of prosecutable evidence left room for doubt and impassioned belief on either side of the story. In public conversation, motive became a theater where speculation often substituted for demonstrable fact and reliable testimony. The result was a cultural tug-of-war between suspicion and the presumption of innocence that justice systems rely on. Journalism that fuels a living mystery. The press played multiple roles: historian, prosecutor, advocate, and sometimes sensationalist interloper in private grief. Investigative reporters combed through archives, compared witness statements, and published long features that set the narrative arc for decades. Some journalism spurred the re-examination of stale files and compelled local authorities to answer questions previously deferred. But chapters of this story also revealed the limits of journalism when key documents went missing and memories conflicted. Documentaries featured dramatic reconstructions that put viewers at the scene of events that otherwise could not easily be proven. Other outlets framed the case as a true crime serial, even using episodic tension and cliffhanger narratives. That style fed public appetite for scandal and made the case a recurring cultural touchstone, less a cold file than a living story. Critics argued that sensational coverage sometimes edged toward presumption of guilt, while other coverage faced critique for protecting celebrity. Either way, the press attention kept the case alive and forced repeated public reckonings with the unknown. Forensics that raise more questions than answers. As science advanced and new eyes examined old wounds, the role of evidence and forensic interpretation grew more complex. Later teams could look at bruises and abrasions with different assumptions, using techniques that had not existed in 1981. Some experts suggested that the pattern of circular bruising around the wrists were compatible with someone being grabbed, and not solely post-mortem handling. Others cautioned that water, temperature, and decomposition can alter skin appearance, thus making confident interpretation difficult. The life jacket worn backwards became a focal point because it suggested confusion or incapacity inconsistent with a deliberate, calm exit. Had a conscious person put on the jacket, why would it have been worn incorrectly in any way unless either panic or inexperience had intervened? The forensic uncertainty left room for two competing stories: tragic accident or an altercation that ended in drowning. When the science yields ambiguity, courtrooms and public opinion must decide which uncertainties matter most to belief. In this case, the balance of ambiguous evidence prolonged doubt and deepened the divide between family and public narrative. Quiet courtrooms hiding deeper battles. The legal aftermath has included civil suits, preservation fights, and a complex choreography of public statements and private filings. Lana Wood's lawyers pressed for civil remedies and a fuller public accounting of evidence that had once been shelved. The civil process demanded a different standard of proof, but offered a forum where documents could be re-examined and aired publicly. Long after Natalie's death, lawyers moved quietly in the wings as families fought over legacy, royalties, and the right to govern Natalie's image. Wagner's defenders insisted all financial moves complied with the law, framing estate management as practical rather than predatory. Still, optics of swift sales and dissolved scholarships provoke questions about priorities and timing after a woman's death. Records and court filings became a new form of storytelling, as spreadsheets and legal memoranda competed with memories and sorrow. To the public, the courtroom skirmishes seemed a second, quieter tragedy unfolding beneath the headline drama. At the center of it all remained a family who sought closure in a system that offers procedure more than catharsis. A myth shaped by memories divide. Over decades, fact, rumor, and personal testimony often overlapped without tidy separation in the collage created by the public's memory. Natalie fans kept her movies in heavy rotation, preserving on-screen brilliance as counterpoint to the darker story of her final night. Wagner continued to work and to write, his career thereafter shadowed by Catalina and the questions it raised. Some in Hollywood defended him fervently, calling decades of friendship and shared work that painted a humane portrait. Others, including family and some reporters, painted a counter-image of a man whose charm masked deeper, more troubling tendencies. That split created a cultural debate about public figures, about how eras of fame can protect, distort, or hide personal failures. For many, the unresolved nature of the case made it persist as more than a historical footnote. It became a modern myth of Hollywood. That myth asked harder questions about power, accountability, and how the industry treats women whose tragedies happen under its bright lights. The debate made clear that memory can become a living force in shaping reputations long after evidence grows cold. New clues that rewrite old certainties. In recent years, new interviews and the release of previously withheld materials continued to complicate the story rather than resolve it. Stefanie Power's more recent comments about redacted autopsy pages and altered files breathed new life into old suspicions for many listeners. Journalists who had earlier seen internal documents corroborated parts of her account, confirming there were redactions and missing pages. Even so, the passage of time blurred details and introduced new disagreements over what exactly had been changed and why. Legal authorities weighed those revelations against the limits of what could be proved and the fairness owed to living subjects. Meanwhile, public interest goes through cycles of renewed attention with each new interview or document that surfaces. Every new detail is like a grain of sand dropped into the gears of memory, forcing the machinery of public debate to grind anew. For those who love Natalie, every revelation brings hope and exhaustion. a reopening of grief that never fully closes. This story remains a contested narrative where each new claim invites counterclaim, and every memory competes with documentation. Human truths beneath the public spectacle. There is no easy simplification of accusation or absolution that can be reduced to headlines. The human portrait lives in contradictory gestures and quieter truths. Natalie Wood was a luminous, complex artist whose life contained both triumph and vulnerability, a person not to be reduced to her death. Robert Wagner was a husband, a public figure, and a man whose life intersected with many others in ways both tender and fraught. Stefanie Powers, Lana Wood, and Captain Davern were people shaped by decades of friendship, grief, and the pressure of public testimony. Their memories carry personal truth even as they conflict with other memories and with the limits of legal proof. The cruelty of the story was in the way it converted private pain into a spectacle in which every gesture could be read as a sign or a sin. The families lived with the toll of repeated public scrutiny, a relentless unpicking of wounds not yet healed by time. Reading this case purely as true crime misses the slow human cost behind each headline and courtroom file. At the center are daughters and siblings, living proof that unresolved grief lingers decades after the last newspaper runs its final edition. A mystery that refuses to settle. The death of Natalie Wood still resists simple answers 40 years later and continues to ask urgent, uncomfortable questions. The reopened investigations, witness recantations, and disputed documents have reshaped public memory without delivering a final verdict. For many, the case was a lesson in how power, celebrity, and grief can complicate the work of justice and truth. It also shows how time can remove evidence and simultaneously give strength to the voices that refuse to be silenced. The world, in need of closure, must confront the competing imperatives of legal proof, family peace, and the duty of honest remembering. The mystery on the fogged night at Catalina Island won't rest because life and law operate at different paces and with different aims. As Stefanie Powers' recent remarks reopened old wounds, they also reminded a watching world that memory is never merely private. This is a story that endures because it touches something larger than a single death. It asks how a culture honors truth when fame obscures it. If you continue to watch, you'll find new fragments of testimony, new documents, new arguments, and perhaps someday a fuller answer. As we close this chapter, the story still echoes with unanswered questions. The fog that covered Catalina that night is never fully lifted, and every new interview or uncovered detail seems to bend the truth in another direction. Some moments point toward a tragic accident, others toward something far more complicated. Hollywood's silence, shifting testimonies, missing files, and the weight carried by those closest to Natalie continue to fuel curiosity even after 4 decades. Many who follow this case form their own interpretations as each piece of the puzzle surfaces. Some see hidden truth. Others see memory reshaped by time. Feel free to share how the story sits with you, what stands out, what troubles you, and what you think remains untold. Every perspective helps shape the larger picture that history is still trying to assemble. And if you made it this far, a gentle like and subscribe would mean a lot and help more people discover stories like this.